It's not every day where a 20-year-old game continues to prove itself as one of the best examples of its genre. Even rarer are games where a sequel to a 20-year-old game holds up just as well as the original and arguably its remake, if not being better than it in some ways. Resident Evil 2 is such a game. While most would probably agree that the original was indeed scarier and arguably is the superior game from a horror perspective, Resident Evil 2 improved on the gameplay of its predecessor in just about every other measurable way, while expanding the world that the original game created and raising the stakes for the Umbrella Corporation's plans. Before we begin, please consider subscribing and enabling all notifications by clicking the bell icon. With that out of the way, let's get started. With another entry in the long-standing survival horror staple of gaming on the way, now is about as good a time as any to take a look at one of the series' best games in Resident Evil 2. Where the original Resident Evil used its characters being trapped in a mansion as its main setting and capitalized on the claustrophobia and hopelessness that situation created, Resident Evil 2 opened things up a little bit by being set on the streets of Raccoon City and various buildings around the area. On paper, this might have seemed like a bit of a risk, as trading in the spooky mansion aesthetic for the Raccoon City streets and a handful of other locations might seem like it's giving away too much of what made the original game so effectively creepy and intimidating. However, it was handled so well with the streets being interconnected with the game's various locations that it never really gave you too much of a sense of freedom or control, yet also didn't feel overly guided or linear, even though it really kind of was. Resident Evil 2's world design would have you moving about to different locations much like the original one did, but in this game the path forward made a little more obvious sense much of the time, which gave you a somewhat more steady sense of progression, where the original just kind of plopped you into a mansion with a bunch of doors and a bunch of keys and expected you to figure everything out. There's nothing wrong with that setup either, but it should also be no surprise why so many people favor the second one to the first one for this more logical design that gently guides you from one location to the next without ever really forcing you down super linear pathways like later, more action-heavy games would. This was also helped immensely by Resident Evil 2's fantastic map that was instantly intuitive, letting you know where you've been, which doors need which keys, and so on. There wasn't quite as much backtracking either, and when there was, it usually felt more deliberate and interspersed with more coordinated sections of the game. That's not to say it leaves other great ideas from the original game's design in the dust though. The limited ammunition and resource management is still a major part of the experience here, and learning to master that is the key to getting through the game in one piece. Ink ribbons being tied to saves and the magic crates both return from the original game and are once again used to great effect. The game does change up quite a bit when it comes to the characters and story though. Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield are both brand new characters as far as this game is concerned, and they have their own interconnected journeys to see through here. While the story does stand apart from that of the first game in most ways, it also ties into the general lore of the series in a smart way that doesn't require you to play the first one, but it does reward you if you do with greater understanding of the context surrounding them, especially Claire, as she's Chris's sister from the first game. Now, I wouldn't personally say that I prefer Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield over Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield as main characters, but I do think it's fair to say that you could really go either way. All four characters are fun to play as and interesting to learn about. By the end of Resident Evil 2, you'll feel just as familiar with Leon and Claire as you did with Jill and Chris at the end of the first game. And that's exactly the way it needed to be. It doesn't outshine the first game's characters, but it also doesn't fall below them either. It's right on par with them, and builds on the lore of the series in a thoughtful and respectful way. However, as a whole, I would say the entirety of the cast of the characters from Resident Evil 2 definitely surpasses the original, with compelling side characters like Ada Wong and Sherry Birkin, which are far more interesting than the small handful of side characters that you come across in the first game. They're very different types of people from Leon and Claire, and that makes the cast of characters just feel more vibrant, which makes the story more interesting generally. Resident Evil 2 plays it safe where it needs to though, and doesn't change a whole lot about the general gameplay, The controls are still tanky, the camera angles are still fixed, and using your weapons is still a very deliberate, borderline clunky affair that requires precision and patience. By today's standards, it's easy to see why a lot of gamers probably prefer the controls of the remake, but for its time, Resident Evil 2 handles these newly forged rules of the survival horror genre about as well as you could expect him to. It wouldn't be long before Silent Hill and Dino Crisis would improve on these systems, but again, in 1998, this is how survival horror games played, and Resident Evil 2 played better than just about any other one before it. Camera angles are set up in a relatively logical way that minimizes the disorientation that can sometimes pop up with games of this style. For example, Resident Evil 2 also plays it pretty safe when it comes to its graphics and presentation. Although it's pretty clear that the still archaic blocky character models of 1998 have a little more detail than the ones from the original game. Faces, hair, and clothes, while still admittedly antique-looking by today's standards, are still a noticeable improvement over the first game, which isn't that much older than this one. The pre-rendered backdrops make a return for Resident Evil 2 and, by and large, are just as good as the ones from the last game, if not a little bit better in a couple areas. If you're lucky enough to end up with the Dreamcast version, then you would get an even more detailed version of the game with sharper models and a few extra goodies thrown in, like the data gallery and battle modes. To put it simply, Resident Evil 2 is the game that did everything a good sequel is supposed to do and more. It kept what worked with its predecessor, conservatively improved upon what did not, and steadily built on the overall story of the series with new characters and new situations, without stepping on the toes of the original game. That's quite a balancing act for any game to pull off, especially one in a relatively new genre, and during a time in video games when the rules of 3D adventure gameplay were still being figured out. There wasn't much of a rulebook to go by back then like there is now. Many Resident Evil fans call the second one their favorite, and even if you're not one of them, you should still have no trouble admitting that it is one hell of a game.
Where am I?
It worked!
Oh, Sherry, you're gonna be okay.
Thanks, Claire.
It's over.
No. I have to find my brother.
You're right. This is just the beginning.
That's all for now. If you enjoy what you saw, please hit the like button. And if you're new to the channel, now is a great time to subscribe. We upload brand new videos every single day. After subscribing, don't forget to enable all notifications by clicking the bell icon. Thanks for watching this video, and we'll see you next time, right here on GamingBolt.